Welcome to Get Rich Education. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold, discussing the vilified way that landlords are often portrayed in society and media. Then a great guest and I discuss the real estate takeaways that he gleaned from the greatest real estate investing event that I've ever attended, including if there are any ominous signs for the housing market, today on Get Rich Education. You know, a lot of investors choose either cash flow or home price appreciation, but one real estate market could provide both: Jacksonville, Florida. They've got 27% lower home prices and higher rents than the national median. Their market has appreciated 34% more than other comparable cash flow markets over the last 30 years. Get positive cash flow today and above average appreciation for tomorrow. They often have available inventory in Jacksonville, if you can believe that. Start at cashflowandgrowth.com. You know, starting in real estate seems hard for some. Even experienced investors can find it difficult to achieve the success that they had hoped for. What if there was one small change everyone could make that would solve these challenges? Allie Boone offers a book that really no one else has. It's an easy-to-understand glimpse into the real estate investing industry and your mindset. It's life lessons on hacking your mind before you hack your wallet. Her book to grab on Amazon is called Not Your How-To Guide to Real Estate Investing.
You're listening to the show that has created more financial freedom than nearly any show in the world. This is Get Rich Education.
Welcome to Get Rich Education, from Thunder Bay, Ontario to San Francisco Bay, California, and across 188 nations worldwide. I'm Keith Weinhold. The way that landlords are portrayed in society and media today, and really historically, at times it's like they're reviled or like they're despicable human beings. So the media is generally no friend of landlords. You just got to think about what makes headlines sometimes in most local sources or leads on the evening news. It's something like, landlord refuses to make repairs, or landlord evicts tenant on Thanksgiving Day. Rarely would you read a story with a headline like, landlord provides decent housing at a reasonable cost while paying his taxes. Or you probably wouldn't read something like, landlord helps tenant that's down on his luck by deferring his rent payments for a month. To be sure, all of those things happen, but negativity is what sells, and that's what the media goes for. That, unfortunately, reinforces a bad rap. It's sort of like a baseball umpire or basketball referee. You're only going to hear about landlords in the case that they do a very wrong thing. People are unaware of, or perhaps they forget, or oftentimes I think they're just blind to the examples of government interference in the housing market and all of the skewed incentives that were and are associated with that. Before I share the worst media example of vilifying landlords that I have ever read in my entire life, let's just lighten it up for a moment. This is comedian Neil Brennan on landlords.
You know what the worst part of having a landlord is? People think it's the money. It's so not the money. Worst part of having a landlord is having to call the landlord. It's a bit of an exaggerated title, isn't it? For a guy who rents out rooms to strangers for money? Landlord? Like there's something medieval about the whole thing? Whenever I see my landlord now, just to mess with him, I'm always like, my lord, I come to thee from the kingdom of apartment 4J. My lord, if you wouldn't mind taking off your cape, I need you to unclog my toilet.
Yeah, landlording isn't always glamorous. Now, though you might be a rental property owner like me, you might not actually be the landlord if you're outsourcing your management to a professional management firm. Let me tell you about the worst recent media example, though, of the way that landlords are portrayed in the media. This is from an academic publication at some level here in the Chantilly News. Now, I usually cite major media or industry articles, but I'm making an exception because this is such a standout. It might almost be hard for you to believe this, but I'll link it in the show notes and you can see it for yourself at getricheducation.com/353. Just get this. The article title, the headline is Landlord System Morally Unethical, Contributing Nothing to Society. Okay, here's the article. The depiction of landlords in the media, to put it lightly, is less than appealing. A scruffy old man furiously pounds against his tenant's door, demanding that the rent be paid up. Ignoring the fact that his tenant is struggling to even put food on the table, the landlord writes up an official eviction notice giving them a maximum of 2 weeks to get their things and leave for good. While only a small percentage of landlords embody this portrayal, all landlords, regardless of how nice they appear or behave, perpetuate a system that marginalizes the working class. The article goes on to say, landlords can be very unfair and often have a power imbalance against the tenant. First things first, landlords in general are greedy. They actively partake in and directly benefit from a system that commodifies a necessary element for survival, housing. Just like food and water, everybody deserves a roof over their head. So therefore, landlords who purchase rental properties with the sole intention of exploiting other people to simply live in them are immoral and corrupt. There's no actual need for landlords. Besides the case that a tenant genuinely wants to temporarily rent a home rather than buy it, well then those who do want to purchase and own a home of their own but they can't afford it and must rent it from someone who happens to have the excess funds to own more than one living space. Available housing is already extremely scarce as it is. By buying up houses to rent out, landlords not only decrease the opportunities others have to own a home, but they also restrict the supply of housing and increase their profits at the expense of others. Quote, housing should be a universal right, end quote, Senior Sneha Nagarakanti said. Landlords are one of the reasons why housing is not accessible for people with minimum wage jobs, even though they have minimum facilities and space. And then the article ends up by saying, many landlords don't do any actual work. The work put into building the home is done by constructors and property developers, while the work put into maintaining the home is done by plumbers and exterminators, etc. In the case that individual landlords do their own maintenance and repairs, the amount of money and work put into those repairs is rarely the same quality as the work put into a landlord's own home. Landlords are being paid for simply having ownership over an item that another does not have, which is absentee ownership. And because landlords are profiting off of someone renting out their private property in which they do virtually no labor upon, they are rent-seeking, a practice that allows a party to gain wealth through manipulating economic conditions. Meanwhile, a tenant must work extra hours to make a higher income to pay the rent. Landlords can simply raise the rent and acquire more properties to rent out, creating an endless cycle where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. A landlord takes advantage of the tenant like a parasite while not helping the tenant. Nagarakanti said, quote, although the landlord provides housing, the housing cost doesn't correspond to the quality of the housing available in regards to space and amenities. That's end quote and end of the article. I'm going to respond to that in more shortly. But, there really are some more sinister reasons percolating for this landlord vilification. And what it really is, I think, is success envy. A lot of people in our society just have this general disdain about money. They think money is somehow evil or bad inherently in itself, and money should be looked down upon. Of course, money's not evil. It could be used for that, but it is a tool. There are those tenants who feel that it is simply okay to take away other people's property, especially if those that are being taken from are quote-unquote rich. To some people, landlords are just by definition rich, so I guess it must be okay to steal from them or tax them or just generally hinder their ability to do business. Well, that really typifies this envy and resentment. Some people just resent success, but they want to try to point to anything else as the problem, and rather than looking inwards at themselves, it's just easier and more convenient to blame others. But the good news here is you can play a role in helping reverse this landlord stereotype. That is the good news. Now, I've talked before about how at times I've used this subtle way to just kind of mention to my tenants that, I do have a mortgage to pay every month and I have a property tax bill. A lot of tenants, they just don't know that. I didn't know that when I rented my first place. Now, I have noticed with my own two eyes, though, as I've been the property owner, I've noticed a change in disposition with any tenant that thought it was kind of okay to pay the rent late once they understand that I do have these real and substantial recurring expenses. And you know what? Maybe a couple times I've even mentioned to a tenant something like, well, my wife and I, we don't have 401k plans. Like these properties, they are it for us. Like they are the retirement plan for me. But I haven't droned on and on to tenants about the valuable role that landlords serve. They just don't see everything that we do to provide and maintain their housing. They just don't see the overall entrepreneurial risk that we take. There are just some things that tenants don't see or think about, like the cost of, for example, replacing a roof every 30 years and how that gets amortized over the life of the building or over the life of the roof. In the landlord-tenant relationship, generally the landlord, they're the ones that have to be the more responsible one. There's just more to be responsible for, financially and otherwise. The fact that less responsible people than the tenant want to criticize more responsible people is ridiculous. We do good here at GRE. I don't want property owners to be slumlords, which basically means keeping property in poor condition with deferred maintenance issues like inadequate lighting or poor drainage or appliances that don't work. So be honest and upright in your dealings with tenants. Treat them fairly. Keep things maintained. That really is the best thing that you as a landlord can do for your reputation and everything else. But just as importantly, defend what we do as landlords when you can. If someone calls you or anyone else a slumlord, speak up, defend yourself. Tell them how hard you work to provide a decent place for people to live. Let them know it's kind of difficult to be a business owner at times and that your expenses rise every year. And, tell them how much you had to learn and study and try and fail and try again to do this job. And this was all before you even began doing any of this. Educate people where you can. You can speak at civic organizations. Give a talk at your kid's school or at your church. Help others understand the power of sound finances. Maybe become a mentor to someone trying to get started in real estate, and then they can help spread the word. So we really can counter what people hear every day about landlords from the media and from others around them. And change doesn't come easy with something like this. And you're definitely not going to convince everyone, but at least you will have stood up for yourself and maybe make someone think twice or even once in the future. That is, after all, how change happens. And if it weren't for such things as individual landlords, mom and pop landlords, or even larger private ownership groups, well then, really, what other economic model should be followed then? Government housing? I mean, just look at that track record. That does not turn out well. Just look at how quickly so many public housing projects quickly dilapidate. It hasn't worked, and the government knows this. They want you and I to provide the housing, and that's also why the tax code is such a roadmap of incentives for those like you that provide housing. Yeah, it's a roadmap, as Tom Wheelwright says. Landlords are often stigmatized because it's largely misunderstood, but you know what? You can help do something about it. That really is the bottom line. Well, it's more than just light dinner table topics around here. The greatest real estate investing event that I've ever attended is the Real Estate Guys Investor Summit. Now, I didn't go to that this year, but a friend of the show here did. So he's going to fill us in on what happened during that 8-day summit and more straight ahead. I'm coming to you from upstate Pennsylvania on a warm summer day. I'm soon set to fly northwest and spend the balance of the summer in Anchorage, AK, to escape some of the heat. Let's catch up with Damion Lupo. We've got a close friend of GRE here. He's a robust entrepreneur and expert in real asset investing like real estate and precious metals and some other things. And he's authored a number of well-received books in those spaces and elsewhere. He's actually quite a prodigious author. He's even a 5th degree black belt. He really specializes in helping you get control of your retirement funds and making all of its future gains tax-free with the eQRP. Welcome back to Get Rich Education, Damion Lupo.
Keith, it is so good to be back, man. Great to see you.
Damion, you are out and about just as much as anyone else I know. A lot of networking. You're a frequent conference attendee as well as a speaker yourself. And one of those places where you were a speaker yourself was at last month's Real Estate Guys Investor Summit at Sea. Just a fantastic event, one that I attended in 2016. So what were some of your takeaways there? What did you deliver to other people? And what are some of the things that you learned at the Summit at Sea or the Summit on Sand?
This one was the Summit on Sand because the cruise ships have been dry docked. It seems like maybe forever, but it was an amazing experience with a lot of key, powerful, brilliant people like Robert Helms, Russ Gray, Doug Duncan, the chief economist at Fannie Mae, Robert Kiyosaki, Tom Wheelwright, Kenny McElroy. Like some of the favorites on the show here were all teaching and just hanging out. There was a big conversation about what's coming, and we're all trying to figure it out. One of the things that was clear is that we have a big problem macro-wise. We have a big problem, and that's why there's all this printing. And so the question was, what do we do with it? When's it going to go off a cliff? And here's something very interesting. Talking with Doug Duncan, he was talking about Fannie Mae and what they see and where things are going. We have a big supply shortage. And the question is, how did that happen? And he basically said it came down to this. After the GFC in 2008, about 75% of the supply chain disappeared. For the last 13 years, we had this shrinking of production. And so it never really came back. And so we had a quarter of the supply chain trying to produce, which is why we have 4 million missing units. So what does that mean for people that are looking at real estate? It means that in all likelihood, well, if you just look at the numbers, the math doesn't lie. We're going to have a pretty big boom and sustainable production of housing apartments for probably many years to come. It doesn't mean our system is not on. It's not a house of cards. What it does mean is the real asset of real estate is not likely to get hammered because you just have the pressure of demand with the lack of supply. So that was a big takeaway. Yes, we should all be concerned about the printing. And yet, if you're looking at real assets that have fundamentals and a foundation for long term, then you're in a pretty good place thinking about those type of assets to invest in.
As far as the number of housing units currently available for sale, we're at about 1/3 of the level that we've been at in recent history. So when it comes to eventually, someday, bringing the housing supply back up commensurate to a demand level, did Doug Duncan or anyone else have any insights on whether that can even happen in the next decade? Some economists just say, yeah, generally, it might take us a decade of building just to bring us back into balance.
The chatter there with Doug and other people was that this was not going to be fixed short term. In 10 years, maybe, but you're talking about a massive amount of ramping up of production. So all the different suppliers of all the different things, and all of those got stalled out in 2020 in a big way, and they were already reduced over the last 10 years. Right now, we have massive constraints in supply chains. And then there's some manipulation, things like the lumber. We have massive surges, 4 or 5x of what it was a year ago, which is really screwing up a lot of building plans with their budgets. And what's really fascinating is when you dig down, you realize when you get insights into on the ground stats, the stats are there's piles of lumber in these different lumber yards in the Northeast and across the US that aren't being shipped. So then you say, well, why is that? Maybe it's a little bit of manipulation. So some of these things are going to have to work themselves out. The market will generally do that. But right now, I think there are some companies and industries that are taking advantage of it. But in general, there's just a big problem with supply. And that's not a short-term solution. It's just going to become more of a shift towards more expensive rentals and probably more people housing together. The belief is what people said was we're looking more towards renter nation and where people are, that's what's happening. It's very European. Either you have a house for 200 years in your family or you're renting. You have your flat. We're seeing that. That's more likely to be more and more the case, even though Fannie has a directive to go and help create housing through their lending. There's also a shift at Fannie, and this is public, but most people don't know. They want to shift to where they incentivize and create more opportunity for investors to buy investment houses versus second homes. Because right now, second homes and investment homes are both, they're blobbed together. And they say our mandate is to have 7% of our portfolio being these two. But they want to focus more towards the investors because they know the investors that are going to go provide the housing are important for the housing supply.
There are a lot of interesting things that you said there. Yeah, I think many can predict that the homeownership rate could very well be on a multi-year decline, largely due to increased prices. Lower interest rates, they don't help the first-time homebuyer that still wants to come up with a 20% down payment. You need to come up with a larger down payment, and not everyone can take advantage of this. Fewer homeowners means more renters, of course. Damion, did you learn of any ominous signs there? I mean, one great part about being at a summit is you do get viewpoints from different people. So I just wonder if anyone had any ominous takes about housing prices. We now see the median sale price of a single family home that's exceeded $350K for the first time. I still feel pretty good about housing. It really has more to do with things like low interest rates. And it's really about the fact that now you have a more credit-worthy borrower than you had in the GFC. Importantly, now you have more homeowners that have had more equity than ever. Homeowners have more equity than they've ever had in American history. Therefore, they're less likely to walk away. And then, of course, there's the aforementioned chronic supply problem. So were there any ominous thoughts there? Because I'd like to think about different takes and different sides.
There's an interesting combination of the equity piece, which we didn't have back in 2007 and 8. There are people that had nothing, no skin in the game. And now it's happened. All this money has been pushed into the system, which has trickled. Many people have heard the statistic that the $9 trillion that was printed, the billionaires ended up increasing their net worth by about $5 trillion, which means there's just another $4 trillion about to hit their balance sheets. What's happened is all this money has come into the system. It's pumped up assets. People have sold assets, and then they're going and they're using that to create equity for their new purchases of homes. Californians moving net exit at California into places like Austin and around the West. You're right. There's more of a stability when you have that kind of equity in place. The rates are likely to stay low, even though the Federal Reserve said they believe that they're intending to possibly do an increase or something to that effect, where it was that's coming in 2022. Maybe there's 25 or 50 basis points that we increase. What George Gammon talked about, and I thought was really relevant, the Fed is not really the driver. It's the commercial banks and how they go out and lend. Because the Federal Reserve is the initial layer of the money supply, but then the commercial banks are where all the money actually gets pushed into the system. There's a big talk about the central bank digital currency, the CBDC, and taking the banks out of the equation where money comes directly from the Federal Reserve, which is an interesting thing if you think about it, because that would mean Wells Fargo, Citibank, Goldman, they're all irrelevant. That was a totally different thing. That's just something for people to think, wow, is that possible? It's happening. The commercial banks, they've been pretty hesitant to lend in general to consumers, but what they are doing is they're lending and they're pushing money to certain groups of people that are very creditworthy, public companies, hedge funds, just big institutions. Where does that take us? What's going to happen? There's an accumulation of wealth by bigger institutions, by wealthier people. We see that a lot. What really came out of this was that the system that we're in is not sustainable, and there is likely to be a very big reset. And the question was, what does that even look like? Is it a bundle of currencies with an SDR? Is it a gold-backed currency? That was part of the working theory by a number of us last month, was that we're going to have some type of currency that's going to be partially gold-backed. If we have a collapse, we may collapse into the dollar. The dollar is like the ugliest. They're all ugly, but this is the least ugly thing at the dance. And so if we fall back into the dollar, we may actually see the dollar get stronger in a crash. Just like the Deutschmark got stronger, it inflated. It was getting worse and worse for a number of like 3 or 4 years. And then it actually increased. It got stronger for about a year. And then it collapsed in the early 1920s. We may see something like that. And if everything collapses, to regain confidence, what the suggestion is that we're likely to see gold coming back in as a basis so people can have faith. Otherwise, you have absolute chaos because the entire world is on fiat. So there's nothing backing anything anymore. And that may be why there's an accumulation of gold in China, India, the IMF, like why gold is being accumulated by the tons and tons and why China's not selling. They're accumulating, mining, and buying. That's what we think is coming.
It's interesting that you bring up CBDCs, central bank digital currencies. 2 weeks ago, when we had Jim Rogers here on the show, I gave my audience a primer on what CBDCs are. You talk about more printing that's going on, currency creation. Then we're coming up on next month, the 50th anniversary of a big part of the Nixon shock. That was August 15th, 1971, when President Nixon, essentially what he did is he said that nations that hold U.S. debt can no longer redeem that debt for gold. So there's really a lot of interesting confluence of circumstances here. However, that does mean that we have been on a completely fiat dollar standard for 50 years. Some people probably didn't think it could last that long. Here we are. The common thing that I'm hearing about is it really all comes down to faith in the currency. That's really what holds us up. I think some people could make the argument there's really no intrinsic value truly in gold or in things like Bitcoin, but they can still be faith-backed. The dollar can still be backed by the world's largest military, which the United States has, but truly intrinsic, no one uses these things to heat their home or anything like that. With this common theme really being more currency creation, what was the buzz about inflationary pressures that you've been learning about at the Investor Summit on Sand and elsewhere, Damion?
Inflation was funny because it was almost this laughable event because there's always the official numbers, the CPI. Right. And so we're told, oh, it's 3%. Okay, that's a little bit higher than we thought. And yet we go to the grocery store and things are 20% higher than they were a year ago. So I don't know that there was anybody that thought we were going to have deflation or we were going to have less inflation immediately. There's a great book called The Price of Tomorrow that Jeff Booth wrote, and it's talking about deflationary pressures from technology. So that's a very real thing. When you have a lot of technological advances, that's exponential. That can easily be faster than the printing, but the printers can just add more zeros. And so they can go exponentially fast. What we're all seeing in reality is that we have a lot of inflation and you have to start thinking about how you utilize debt as an asset. And that was one of the shifts. It used to be that you have an asset and debt was your liability. Well, now the asset's the liability and the debt is your asset. And so it's a rewiring of how we think about money, finance, investing completely. And there was a consensus. That was really what it was. How do you have debt? How do you have as much debt as possible that where the asset continues to inflate and your debt is fixed? So really thinking about what you do with locked in terms for like institutional money. How do you get things that aren't going to blow you apart if rates go up? Now, can rates really go up? I don't know. I mean, institutionally or central bank that type of planning, it doesn't work very well if treasuries are at 6 or 7% because then the national budget blows up because of the interest payments. The consensus was that rates are likely to stay very low, at least at the central planning area. Inflation, there was a lot of talk about stagflation and how that happens. Russell Gray did an amazing piece on stagflation and explaining what happens when you have pricing going up. Labor's not, the pricing of labor, the cost of labor isn't necessarily moving as fast as the price of goods. And it's a very strange environment that we haven't seen in 40 years. It actually seems like it's happening right now. Inflation, yes, consensus is we're driving it up. One of the questions is how fast deflation pushes back, but there is going to be a race to print, and it's already happening, and we don't see any signs of that really abating anytime soon. Stagflation,
the etymology of that word, it is a portmanteau of stagnant and inflation. That means where we have a stagnant economy where there's little or no growth, yet we have monetary inflation at the same time. Stagflation, a phenomenon that occurred about 50 years ago in the 1970s in the United States. With that being a possibility, the latest core PCE number was published by the government a couple weeks ago. It came in at 3.4%. That might not sound too high, but it could be indicative of more inflationary pressures because that actually is the highest reading since 1992. And the Fed looks at the core PCE in making their policy decisions, even though the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, is typically the headline one. Was there more discussion on whether people think that this higher inflation level is merely transitory, essentially meaning temporary due to the low base effects that we had last year with the recession, or whether it's here to stay? Was there much discussion about that?
It was more of like a comedy show talking about transitory, like as if that was going to come and go. It's really funny when you look at these numbers and the way the government accounts work. They'll look at something like the inflation. They'll say, okay, what does it cost to live? And what they're diverting back to or reverting or inventing is that we're going to just look at how much it costs to rent a place. They're really ignoring the cost of the assets. When you hear 2 or 3%, they're not looking at the cost. So what does that mean? They're anticipating, like Klaus, in the Great Reset in his paper in Europe that none of us are going to own anything and we'll be happy with it. That was part of the conversation too. And so we're being set up for a time where it only is 3% because we actually don't own anything. So 3% increase in cost to rent our lives. Ed Griffin talking about that is obviously an interesting conversation because he's been talking about that for 50, 60 years, that we're shifting into a place where the planners would like people to just be happy not owning, to where the central authorities, the elites own and control things. The actual inflation numbers you're talking about, it could be transitory in their eyes, but there's a sociological shift from people owning and actually experiencing what's happening in real inflation to a place where people don't really notice it because, hey, my rent hasn't moved that much. I mean, I'm never going to own anything, so I'm kind of just a slave. That should be the bigger thing we're thinking about, is the shift from control and ownership to a place where you're just a subject.
Damion Lupo and I are talking about real estate, monetary policy, and inflation, and he's giving us a good summary on what he learned on last month's Investor Summit on Sand. You're listening to Get Rich Education. More when we come back. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. Hey, is your IRA in a real estate syndication? Yikes, a 37% UBIT tax could hit you, but you still have a chance to set up your eQRP and avoid this. Did you make too much money in 2020 and need more deductions? Now federal law lets you set up an eQRP in 2021 and get deductions for last year, retroactively. Even put old IRA and 401k money in Bitcoin, gold, or your own business. Get control of all of your retirement money, tax and penalty free. Text eQRP in all capital letters to 72,000. The people that our listeners can't stop talking about are Ridge Lending Group, NMLS 42056. They've provided GRE listeners with more loans than anyone, and it's where I got my last few loans. They finance single-family income property up to 4plexes. They're the #1 lender for beginners and veterans. Start your pre-qualification, chat with President Chaley Ridge personally, and get your custom plan for expanding your cash-flowing portfolio. Start at ridgelendinggroup.com.
This is the Real Wealth Network's Kathy Fettke, and you are listening to the always valuable Get Rich Education with Keith Weinhold.
Welcome back to Get Rich Education. We're talking with Damion Lupo about what's happening in the economy. He's giving us a good summary about what happened at the recent Real Estate Guys Investor Summit on Sand. You can learn more about Damion and how he helps people with the best retirement vehicle I have ever heard of in my life, called the eQRP, at eqrp.co. Damion, one thing that the Real Estate Guys often talk about, Robert Helms and Russell Gray, that hosted the summit that you were on, is before we're real estate investors, we're investors. And prior to this asset price run-up, we were already on the longest expansion in American history, economically speaking, with a 12-year expansion. And we've had such an asset price run-up that you got to think about the sentiment of some people today. A lot of people think that they can just throw a dart on a board and pick a winner, whether that's Dogecoin or whether that's an income property that they buy in Alabama. Tell us more about really the speculative nature that might have really crept into an entire generation of people now and the risks that that might have.
This is something that you read about in the classic Market Wizards, different books from the 1920s and 30s. It's when you start hearing things in taxi cabs and coffee shops, then you should start getting scared.
Right.
When people are saying, oh, it's so easy. I just go buy Dogecoin, or I just get a house and then I'm going to make 100,000 next week because I flipped it to some other unsuspecting fool. And that's really what I'm seeing a lot of the FOMO. They're not thinking. They're not actually thinking about the fundamentals. In California in particular, many people invest not because anything makes sense cash flow wise. They just expect to have 15, 20% of price appreciation. They end up selling something. It's fundamentally, investing has to have a foundation or eventually it falls into the basement. And I'm seeing a lot of people ignoring that. And a lot of it's because they're looking around seeing people making money. The problem with a lot of people making money is that they don't actually realize that they're just gambling. They caught a really good wave. I did the same thing in the early 2000s, caught a wave, made a ton of money, but I didn't understand the fundamentals and foundation, which is how you lose $25 million. I don't recommend that plan, but I see a lot of people going down that path at different levels. And it's simply because they're not asking hard questions. They're not saying, okay, this house has gone up 300% in 3 years. And that's happened in a lot of places in the Rust Belt where it's literally gone from 30 to 90,000. And they say, well, it could keep going up. And I'm like, sure. And cows could fly over the house, and they might. And it's more likely to have your house appreciate. But are you going to see 300% or even 100%? You have to ask, why would that happen? Some places you have constraints of supply. You have things that are going to keep pushing prices. But ultimately, it comes down to people being able to pay. Something we didn't talk about is this creep of universal basic income and these government subsidies. That really changes the equation. But it doesn't mean that a house that's 400 is now going to be able to be worth 800. It means that things that are like affordable housing could be mobile home parks, things like that. B and C apartments could be a beautiful place because when government's printing money and you've got fixed debt, you're kind of golden. So I think it's really important for people to step back and say, why am I buying? I did a test on myself, Keith, about a month ago because I'm a pretty big crypto fan. And I was getting people telling me about these different altcoins, and we call them SHIT coins. And I said, okay, somebody said, MILF coin is where it's at. And I said, that's super funny. Okay, I want to be a part of this. So I threw a couple $1,000s and I watched over 4 days my psychology. It was interesting watching me because I was up 600% in 24 hours. And I thought, amazing, I'm going to the moon. Based on what? I don't even know what MILF does. And I did that because I wanted to experience the emotion of what most people in the market are doing. They're not investing. I invest in Bitcoin, Ethereum, Chainlink, different things like that because of the fundamental shift in what they're doing to solve problems, to create more freedom for people and bring the 4 billion unbanked into the system. That's why I invest in those. That's why I'm taking my fiat and converting it. Why I invested in MILF was an experiment on how stupid I can get in a matter of minutes with my money. I think we need to really step back. The essence is that people need to look at the fundamentals and understand why they're doing it. And if it's just to make, they call it price go up. If your thing is, okay, I'm investing just for price go up, Bitcoin or real estate, you better take a pause because you're about to have a reckoning happen.
Indeed. It's that difference between investing and speculating. Investing is buying for sound fundamentals with something that pays you an income stream, regardless of what happens with the capital price. That doesn't mean a person cannot make out through capital gains and price appreciation, but one has to question whether that's really investing or not. Damion, one place people can almost guarantee a better return, and guarantee isn't a word you want to use very often in investing, is when you reduce your tax burden on your gains. And you're really an expert at helping people take their retirement funds and transfer them into something that's more tax advantaged than what some of these traditional retirement accounts are, like 401ks and IRAs. So tell us more about the eQRP, the Enhanced Qualified Retirement Plan.
Years ago, I started digging into the tax code. I watched my parents and I watched a lot of people retiring really pretty broke, and they were following a system. And so I started digging in, seeing, okay, why is this happening? And the more I dug in, the more I realized it's almost like a secret part of the code. And it's not secret, it's in plain sight, but most people don't look at it because it's not on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. And ultimately, what we're talking about is getting your retirement money, which is where most of the liquidity in America is. There's $35 trillion in these accounts. And so the question is, well, how do you use that to benefit your future? The biggest problem people have is taxes. It's approximately 70% of your money that you earn over your lifetime goes to taxes. It's crazy. And yet we do it by default. And so the alternative is a Roth account. Now, Roth was built in the late 90s. It's how the US government balanced the budget, and they all celebrated. But what they did is they stole from the prosperity of the future by bringing in all this tax revenue so that individual investors that were savvy could take their taxes down to zero forever. That's what the Roth, and especially the Roth eQRP. It's a way to take all of your retirement money, invest. And here's one of the coolest things right now, in particular, because of the crypto space, nobody seems to know what crypto is. I'm talking about the government. They're like, okay, well, is it money? Is it an asset? Is it like, what do we call this? Is it a fish? Like, we don't know. We don't exactly know how it's going to be taxed. One of the best things you can do is get things into a vehicle that is never taxed. And the Roth eQRP is the way that people can take their assets, whether it's they're flipping a house or they're buying crypto or gold, and they put it into a Roth eQRP and it's never taxed, even when you pull it out. One of the things that we're doing a lot now because of the real estate rules that were put in place under Trump is that we're able to use real estate to get people's money. We buy real estate and then we use all the cost segregation and depreciation to be able to offset the conversion to Roth. What does that even mean for somebody? It means that you can have pre-tax money from your 401ks or IRAs and get it into a Roth state and then pull it out at any age with no tax at all ever for anything. What I said is, if you want to pay taxes or you don't want to pay taxes, you get to choose. If you have the right team around you and you have the right information, we're at a point in history with the laws that if you put all these things together, you can really opt out of the tax system legally, not tax evasion, tax avoidance, tax planning. It's super fun because of everything working together. The stars have aligned in a weird way.
When you began to help people get into eQRPs, a lot of people were like, wait, such a thing exists? I never heard of this. And now you've been doing it for a number of years, and you do actually have a lot of successful case studies.
This is actually the 10th year anniversary of the book that was originally published a decade ago. And now there's close to $1 billion that's been pulled out of traditional retirement accounts. And I always laugh when I hear people say the word traditional. I'm like, what's more traditional than gold or real estate?
Exactly.
Like, traditional, but we call it alternative. It's fun to see $1 billion that's now in people's hands where they control it. It's the ultimate self-responsibility. It's the ultimate ownership of self. Because if you own your money, then you're in control. If somebody owns your money or it's fiat, it can be manipulated. That's something that I think about a lot. What is money and what are assets? Well, things that are real require energy to create, whether it's gold or real estate, converting a tree into a house. Bitcoin requires taking some type of energy, converting it into another form. So all these, I think about that all the time. And if there's a system that has the ability to print or create without energy, which is what the Fed and the central banks do, it's really a form of theft on everyone. I mean, I love the ability to be able to give people power and control, remove the taxes, remove the ability for the government to steal from them. That's what the eQRP is all about. It's about control, power, and responsibility.
I know you've created tax efficiency for an awful lot of people. For example, in a real estate syndication, if they don't have it structured correctly, they could be hit with a 37% UBIT tax.
The thing that people mostly miss is that there are different tax code pieces. You can invest in real estate a lot of different ways, individually, through a company, through an IRA, through a 401k. And if you invest incorrectly, you may think you're in a tax shelter and all of a sudden you get a tax bomb. And that's specifically about the IRA investors that invest in syndications where they get a 37% tax on a majority of their profits. That's because UBIT, the unrelated business income tax, is triggered when these things cash out. And so a lot of times people don't realize this ticking time bomb is happening or it's sitting there behind the scenes until they get a bill from their accountant and the accountant says, oh, you made $100,000. Great. Here's your $20,000 or $25,000 bill for your Roth IRA. And they say, what? Nobody told me. With the eQRP, it's actually exempt, which means you can invest, you can have apartments, you can have whatever that has leverage, debt, and that's what triggers this. And there is no tax. So there's really a choice. When I say taxes are optional, it's you have to have better information and have better advisors. Otherwise, you're going to do the default, which is paying way too much taxes.
For some people, the contribution limits to IRAs and 401ks are rather paltry and they don't really have that much effect in their lives. But I know that with the eQRP, the contribution limits are substantial.
Right. The interesting thing about the code is that you can pick a vehicle that seems like it's great, but you can't do anything. In an IRA, putting $6,000 a year into an account, I mean, in 20 years, you're going to have, $120,000 of contribution? You're not rich, you're just old. So that doesn't help. With an eQRP, it could be hundreds of thousands of dollars a year with a family. Even with a couple, it could be 120, 130,000 per year. And that could be all Roth if you wanted. There's ways to get a lot of money into the account very quickly. And one of the fun parts is when we have kids involved, because the tax code that changed a few years ago allowed people to pay their kids. You can pay your kids $12,000 a year. They can then take that money tax-free. There's no taxes because it's their own tax bracket. They could contribute that to a Roth eQRP. Now it grows tax-free forever. Never been taxed, never will be taxed. This is where you've got to have better information, because if you have bad information, you're going to make bad decisions and you think they're the best ones because you're missing the whole game.
And a lot of people are missing out on the eQRP. So we're talking with Damion Lupo, a longtime friend of Get Rich Education. He's the founder of the eQRP company. Damion, if someone wants to get started in at least learning more about the eQRP, if they do have a retirement vehicle and you really owe it to yourself to at least learn more, what's the best way for them to do that?
Grab the phone that's probably 5 inches away from you, because we all have this thing called a leash phone. Text the word eQRP to 72,000 and you'll get a copy of the summation of the book. It's about a 15-page special report on the eQRP. And then you'll also have an opportunity to get the physical book, which we'll send to you. So simply text the word eQRP to 72,000. We'll send it out to you. Even if you're like, I don't have an IRA, I don't even care. I guarantee you there's somebody in your life that you can change their life if you're willing to share some information. It costs you nothing other than sending a text out and sharing and becoming a superhero for the people that you care about.
Damion Lupo, it's been fun talking about what's been going on in the economy and about the eQRP. Thanks so much for coming back onto the show.
Thanks, Keith. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, it's an interesting discussion to entertain if U.S. housing would ever become more like Europe's there, where you have generally these long-time sky-high housing prices that often mean homes just stay in the family for decades or centuries and pass along like heirlooms. When it comes to housing prices, since you never know the future and you can't time the market, that's usually not a good idea. You know what you can do? You can take some measure of confidence in that what you're invested in is a basic human need of shelter. And then on top of that, when you stay in the affordable housing area, where you're often just below the median price with what you could call workforce housing, you're probably in the most resilient market segment as well. Hey, just consider how many tenants and potential future tenants are being made right now. A lot of the government handouts to pave over the recession, they have ended. People have got to head back to work, and you know what? There is a place to go. In fact, there are now more than 9 million job openings in America. That is more than 2 million job openings higher than in any time in the last 20 years. So hiring and inflation could both be picking up steam. I mentioned some of the consumer price indices with Damion. One way to forecast future consumer price inflation is with what producers are paying to make this stuff first before it's sold to consumers. That is embodied in that producer price index that I talked about a few weeks ago. Well, its latest reading was 6.6% year over year, a 6.6% increase. That is the highest on record. It's costing producers more to make stuff. So despite problems in the economy that are always going to be present, things are heating up to basically create more tenants. Big thanks to Damion Lupo for his insight. I always like to leave you with something actionable. If a retirement plan with big contribution limits sounds good to you, and more tax benefits, and the ability to invest in nearly anything, you can use it in real estate, gold, Bitcoin, or even your own business, well then learn more about the eQRP by texting eQRP to 72,000. Speaking of taxes, Rich Dad Tax Advisor Tom Wheelwright and I together again soon, probably next week. Until then, I'm your host Keith Weinhold. Don't quit your daydream.
Nothing on this show should be considered specific, personal, or professional advice. Please consult an appropriate tax, legal, real estate, financial, or business professional for individualized advice. Opinions of guests are their own. Information is not guaranteed. All investment strategies have the potential for profit or loss. The host is operating on behalf of Get Rich Education, LLC exclusively.
The preceding program was brought to you by your home for wealth building, GetRichEducation.com.